excited. We're going to go through all of year 12 microeconomics. I'm super excited. I'm a bit nervous, but also it's going to be great. First things first, economics is a social science. Yeah, economics is a social science because it's all about humans. Interesting humans. It's about government. This is my drawing of parliament. And that's okay, I might have to write it. That is parliament. We've got households and we have firms all interacting together. And all these are built from households, from people. And people interact in meeting their economics needs. So that's going to mean households are going to maximize their utility, firms are going to maximize their profits, and governments are going to strive to maximize social welfare. So it's an interaction of people, everyone trying to meet their needs and interacting with each other to do that. In terms of modeling and progressing with social science, we have a problem. The next bit is about the experiments. Experiments are super difficult in economics because we're dealing with people, and people are complicated, and people change their mood days on days. They do different things every day, and it's really difficult to hold all else constant like you would be able to in physics or biology or something. Because we can't do that, because we don't have this assumption, got this cool fancy name here, then we can't test like every physics or biology can, and we have to update our modelling. What do? At A level, we assume everything else is constant. But in reality, at university and beyond, when you actually test economic models, that's not true, and you will have to try and design experiments to make that as realistic as possible, and even do advanced statistics to make that happen as closely as possible. So you're going to have to use advanced statistics. And this helps us make more reliable and more accurate scientific findings in economics, where otherwise we wouldn't be able to because everything else isn't constant. Positive and normative statements. Positive statements are things you can test. Watch out for tricks. There's lots of tricks. Examiners like to trick you here, but be sure it's something that you can test. For example, you can test if the sky is pink. Someone says that, you could design a scientific experiment to test it. This is testable. Something that's not testable is, I believe the sky is purple. The reason why that's not testable is because that is a belief. Beliefs are subjective. One person believes something, another person believes something else. And science can't test the truth in the difference in the opinions. Those are positive statements. And these are normative statements. Normative, positive. In terms of how these influence policy making, it's really cool. Policy making is all about making judgments about what should be done to improve social welfare. So judgments about what should be done. Because it's ultimately an opinion. Ultimately, policy making requires normative statements. It's all about opinions. So we have to have normative statements in politics and in economic policy. However, ideally, that is as well researched as possible and as backed up as possible with correct estimations or as best estimations of the benefits and the costs to help us make really good judgments based on the beliefs and the values of society. So we have normative statements, but we can't escape the fact that there will also have to be a lot of positive statements to help guide our decision making and provide the information and the facts. Now that's not to say that positive statements are always correct. Remember, positive statements can be wrong. They are just testable. So what I'm really saying is I hope policy making uses a lot of normative statements, but very sensibly backed up with as accurate as possible positive statements. Therefore, policy making uses both, and both are important for the kind of society that we have. Next section, the economic problem. Here, the key thing is this opportunity cost. I'm going to trust you are going to revise your definitions super well, like from your textbook. For now, I'm going to simplify it a little bit. Opportunity cost is what you sacrifice in choosing something you prefer. The true definition is something like the second best alternative foregone. Definitely write that down. I'm not advocating you simplify the definition. This definition is going to be central, and what we're going to find in this topic and the next topic is choices in economics pretty much always have an opportunity cost. Every time we make a choice, every time we decide to go roller skating, we are lacking the time to go skateboarding or something. And more concretely, if you have £2 and you want to buy a coffee and a newspaper, being the economist you may want to choose a newspaper, but that means you've sacrificed the coffee. So you've got your newspaper and your coffee, and by choosing the newspaper, the opportunity cost has been the coffee you have sacrificed. Now that's so crucial. Another thing that's so crucial, and again, get that definition so accurately, is this idea of the economic problem. The economic problem is when we have unlimited wants, and questions will trick you with that one. They'll make it sound like wants increase with income. That's not true with this. Unlimited wants, regardless of your income, and limited resources. These two statements together make a really complex problem in economics. We're going to run out of resources, and we are going to be unable to meet people's wants. This is a big problem, and it doesn't really have an easy solution. The best maybe that we could do is to just do the best with what the resources we have, allocate them in the best way possible. So we kind of aim for something called allocative efficiency, which is where we try to maximize social welfare. That doesn't mean it's going to increase forever because we don't have enough resources, but it's just going to be the highest possible with the limited resources that we have. Next section, production possibility frontiers. If you have a curvy PPF, such as capital goods, it's a PPF, and consumer goods, you will find that the more you specialize in one of the goods, so the more you go in towards consumer goods, or the more you go towards capital goods, your opportunity cost will increase and increase and increase. It will be a greater trade-off the more and more you specialize. If you have a straight PPF of capital goods and consumer goods, then that opportunity cost remains the same, always, constant. Opportunity cost. So going from 0 to 1, consumer goods always sacrifices the same capital goods. You're going from, 10 to, that looks like a 7, so you have sacrificed 3 capital goods. So the opportunity cost of going from 0 to 1 consumer goods was 3 capital goods, and that's going to be the same for the second consumer good. Again, maybe not to scale, we're going to be sacrificing 3 capital goods. It will always be the same, that same ratio, but that's not true with the curvy one. To show economic growth, you shift out your PPF. Straight one or curvy one. Economic growth. If you want to show economic decline, shift in your PPF. Allocative efficiency, this one's actually a really cool story, but more on that maybe next time. You will find that one point somewhere on your PPF that you don't know where it is at A level, but it will be somewhere, is going to be that thing, allocatively efficient. Could be there, could be here, could be there, we don't know. Just one place will be allocatively efficient. For example, that one. When you are at that dot, allocative efficiency means you are maximizing social welfare. That's pretty cool. You don't have the tools at A level to know where that is. Possible production. It turns out that everywhere on your PPF, yes, on it, so like on the line, or inside your PPF, is possible to produce. So in other words, is obtainable or is possible to produce. Unobtainable production is everywhere outside it, so not on the red, not beyond the line. The white bit's unobtainable. No matter what, you cannot produce that. Why not? Because your PPF shows the maximum your country or your firm can produce if it uses all of its resources, all of its land, all of its labor, all of its capital, its enterprise, labor, spelling didn't go so well, and it uses it to its full skills and abilities that it has right now. And technology. It's to the max. Nothing more can be achieved. That's why the white bit is unobtainable, and that's why the red bits are obtainable. Movements along the PPF, such as from A to B, will always have an opportunity cost. This movement from A to B has meant you can no longer produce these goods. That is the opportunity cost. That's the same with the straight PPF. You will have an opportunity cost if you move along. When you're talking about macro, it's better to label your axes as capital, goods, and consumer goods. If you're talking about micro, and it's a specific example, you could just use the goods that they're talking about, raspberries and strawberries, for example. Next section. So excited. Here we have this famous economist called Adam Smith. Think a couple hundred years ago kind of time. Long time ago, Adam Smith came up with some really interesting ideas that really pushed economics forward. One of the great ideas was the idea of specialization. Adam Smith studied businesses and realized a lot of them specialized and realized that the specialization brought tremendous growth and benefits to the firms. Benefits of specialization are things like higher skills. If you do the same thing every day, such as building a nail, and just that specific part of a nail, you are going to get really experienced in it, building a lot of on-the-job skills, and therefore you will get extremely skilled at that particular task. That's going to increase workers' productivity. It also makes it easier to hire workers because it's easier to train somebody to only do one specific task and to get really good at that one task. So there's kind of lower training costs. That means you've got a bigger pool of workers to hire. So it might be easier to hire people, and maybe the cost is cheaper. Maybe the labor is cheaper. Overall, with more productivity and more workers all putting their super high skills, a business can expect to have more output. If they have more output, possibly the goods that they produce are going to be cheaper, and it's going to benefit consumers. Prices are going to fall. If, in addition, workers are in a production process, so worker A builds something that worker B needs, and worker C and worker D needs. So let's say somebody crafts the metal, somebody builds the head of the nail, somebody builds the, not sure what that's called, let's go with the pin of the nail and attaches them together before maybe quality checking them. If there is a production process and everyone is specialized and everyone is gaining higher skills, higher productivity, lower training costs, you have a tremendously productively efficient operation with a collection of extremely high skilled workers that can produce thousands more nails than they would individually be able to produce. This comes with some serious disadvantages though. If you just make nails every day and the same part of the nail every day, you are probably going to get bored. And you might want to name drop a cool word called alienation. That means that you get a bit detached from your work and you feel that you're just kind of a cog in the machine, that you're not being treated like a human. Because you're so bored, the company might see a faster churn of workers. Workers leave their jobs because they're not interested, they're not connected, they're not motivated. Specialization requires probably money to be successful. Sounds funny, but think about this. If your company only makes nails, there is no possible way you can pay your employees after like 1 day of them working. Everyone's had their nails. Like, all the nails they will need by just working at the company for 1 day. There is no way that business can continue for day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. You need something to pay your workers, and it's not going to come from nails. But if you exchange your nails for money, and then you can give that money to workers, workers can then buy housing, and they can buy food, and they can buy water, and workers are then happy. Therefore, the company can continue. The same with the owners of the company can be rewarded for their work in a way other than nails. They can also be rewarded with money, the entrepreneurs, and then that can incentivize them and help them reinvest in the company. And then that company can grow. So truly specialized companies like we have nowadays have worked so well in part because of money, because of this medium of exchange. That question comes up. So have a double down on that one, and it's something really important to look at. Types of economies. You've got polar opposites, free market economies and command economies. You also have somewhere in the middle, mixed economies. Most countries in the world are mixed economies, including the UK and including the USA and France. Some are more free market, some are more command. Each of these have costs and benefits. A free market typically leads to more choice and more competition, more innovation and more ideas. A command economy may prioritize things like inequality and poverty more and ensure more equitable access to opportunities. However, in a free market, this ruthless competition might lead to a lot of waste, and it might lead to businesses making fast food, which is not good for us. So not good stuff. Ultimately, free markets can fail, and this is called market failure. Command economies can also get it wrong. The government might think that something is a great idea and it turns out not to be what people want or what people like, in which case that could also create waste. And that is also what we call a government failure. Either way, the economy that the country has, all of these styles are difficult to run and are difficult to get right. Decision-making in economics, we assume people are rational. That means they can accurately assess the costs and the benefits of a decision, which means when you go shopping for a carrot, you are thinking that, well, this carrot has this many grams of this much nutrients and these many minerals, and that's exactly what I need because I read my medical reports and it told me that a carrot is going to be exactly what I need. And at the same time, you'll consider the costs, so you will be saying something like, however, these carrots will take a long time to cook. Perhaps instead I should get the frozen carrots. These are incredibly monotonous and time-consuming calculations that you might not want to do in your daily life when you've got all kinds of other things to worry about. That's what we assume in economics. You compare the costs and the benefits, you weigh them up, and ultimately you think, it's worth it or not worth it. That's how we frame rational decision-making in economics. The problem is, as you saw with carrots, we probably get it wrong. Like most of the time, we probably don't actually fully compare the costs and the benefits, at least not accurately and at least not most of the time. You might have heard some cool words, like we have bounded self-control, or anchoring. or bounded rationality. This describes how in reality you could buy the carrots and then they're sitting there in your fridge and you don't want to cook them because something else is more tasty. Or you just don't bother looking at the cost and benefits of the carrots and you just buy them because you heard of that 5-a-day rule. These are cool words to name drop. There's lots more that you can research on this topic. Consumers could look at the costs and the benefits because they want to maximize something called utility. Utility is kind of their sense of well-being. And everyone decides their utility different according to what they like and their preferences. But we all want to maximize our utility, and free market economics assumes that we want to maximize our utility. It means that we don't really care about anybody else's utility, we just want to maximize our utility. So a free market thinks that we are selfish. And what would be rational is to make us better off. We wouldn't care about anybody else. Next topic. Demand looks like this, usually. Price, quantity, and your demand curve. It's downward sloping. The movement this way is called an expansion. You might hear it called an extension. The movement that way is called a contraction. All these movements are caused by changes in price, which kind of come from changes in supply. If you talk about shifts right or shifts left, those are physical movements of the demand curve. D1 goes to D2 or D2 goes to D1. Shifts might be abbreviated to increase if it's a shift right and a decrease if it's a shift left. The conditions of demand are the things that cause increases and decreases. Conditions of demand. And if I were to summarize them, I would say the conditions of demand are things that affect your willingness to buy something, like the popularity, maybe some cool advertising that you saw, and things that affect the ability are things like maybe your income, whether the store is close to you, like the convenience, can you do online shopping, is it from an app, those kind of things. And a demand curve slopes downwards because of 3 reasons. I'm just going to state them. I'm going to put them in a different color to make it super clear. You have 3 things. One is the income effect. Another is the substitution effect. Imagine you name dropping these. Another one is diminishing marginal utility. These 3 things explain that inverse relationship between price and quantity. If price goes down, quantity goes up. If price goes up, quantity goes down. Inverse relationship, income effect, substitution effect, diminishing marginal utility. To explain diminishing marginal utility, think of eating food. Eating the first meal of the day, going from 0 to 1, brings you like 3 happy faces. It's great, you were very hungry. Going from 1 to 2, probably still a good idea to have lunch. Going from 2 to 3, you're having dinner, still really good, but it doesn't satisfy your hunger as much as that first or that second meal. It's not as kind of satisfying. You do need it, it's beneficial to you, still bringing you happy faces. This is called your marginal utility. That is the increase in utility from the next quantity you eat. The increase in utility from the next quantity. Your total utility is the sum of all of this. So you've got 3, 2, and 1 means your total utility for eating 3 meals in this simple example is 6. Elasticities. Elasticities, PED, YED, and XED, all of these have in common that you do the percentage change in quantity at the top. Actually, even PES, the same, quantities at the top. What you divide by is the thing that it says first. We'll talk about the X bit. Percentage change in price, or income, or price, or PES. That XED is harder to see, but you'll find the same rules apply. Write it out in full. Cost, price, elasticity of demand. This tells you you should put the price on the bottom, but of the other good. Call it other good. That's how you calculate them. In terms of percentage changes, make sure that you have the new value. The new value might not be the one like newest in time. It's like what the question is saying changes to. The one that you change to. Compared to the original value, the one that you change from. Divided by the original one, times it by 100. That would be really great. Remember that one. Write that one down. In terms of unitary elastic PED, you are dealing with a demand curve that looks a bit like that. It's not straight. And that's what makes it special. It makes it have a PED of -1. If the PED is -1 because it's unitary elastic, by the way, the total revenue will always be the same, whatever you do. That's a cool fact. Just write it down. Perfectly elastic is going to look horizontal. The PED is going to be infinity. Technically, PEDs are always negative, so technically that's minus infinity. This means you will never, if you change price, you get no demand. You can only ever sell this good at P1. Perfectly relatively elastic is something like this, kind of like with a shallow or kind of like a flat demand curve. This is relatively elastic. Price, quantity. Now that has actually a lot behind it. If you're curious, watch some of my other videos, ask some questions. I'm happy to answer them. There's a lot more to that. If one is steeper, demand curve is steeper, this is relatively inelastic. Now it's really important that you use the words relatively. There's a story behind that. That story is not easy. It's really important to say that word relatively. Perfectly inelastic is like this. This demand curve always has a PED, that should be a vertical line, PED of 0, always 0. This one here has a PED that's greater than 1. This green one has a PED that's between 0 and 1. PED is always negative. So for example, if you saw a PED of -5, you would just like delete the minus and just see it as 5, and then you will be able to see that this example would be relatively elastic. Okay, we have inferior goods, normal goods, and luxury goods. These relate to YED. If YED is smaller than 0, we have an inferior good. YED is between 0 and 1, we have a necessity. If YED is greater than 1, we have a luxury good. There's lots to this. Happy to talk about this another day. If it's greater than 1, this is going to be relatively elastic. This one's relatively, guess what, inelastic. You can read my handwriting. I'll try better. Substitutes relate to XED, which was that cross-price elasticity. An example of a substitute is Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Most people don't really care switching between them because they provide the same sense of utility. They're interchangeable. If you do this, if the price of Coca-Cola goes up, people are going to stop buying Coca-Cola and switch to Pepsi, so the quantity demanded of Pepsi-Cola will increase. If you look back at the XED equation, when you have the quantity change at the top and the price change of the other good at the bottom, if the price of Coca-Cola is going up, as we said, the quantity of Pepsi is going up too, so this XED is always going to be a positive number for substitutes. If you look at complements, complements are things you buy together, like maybe milk and cereal. If the price of milk increases, people might buy less cereal because it's more expensive. If you put that into your XED equation, you will find if the price of one increases, the quantity of the other decreases. This gives you a negative. Complements have an XED that's negative. In terms of PED and the government, you want to really try and draw this as accurately as possible. So try and draw two graphs side by side. You're taxing both graphs the same, so S plus T, where the tax is the gap between there. And you want to even have the same initial price and the same initial quantity. So Q1, P1, these things are the same. Try that. The only thing you want to do is you want to have one of the demand curves being relatively more inelastic and one of the demand curves being more elastic. If you've done the other bits of this as accurately as possible, it should be clear that the inelastic one has a really high increase in price and a really small decrease in quantity, whereas the elastic one has the opposite, small increase in price, larger change in quantity. So the takeaway is, if the government wants to reduce the quantity, they're not going to be very successful for the inelastic good. They're probably more successful for the elastic good. However, if they want to generate lots of money, tax revenue, it could be a good idea to tax inelastic products. The tax revenue is going to be this gap between them times Q2. It's going to give you a box here. It's going to draw that box. Okay. You can see the one on the left is bigger, even when I drew it wrong. The relationship between PED and total revenue. This one's good fun. If your PED is elastic and you increase the price, your revenue does the opposite. If you decrease the price, your revenue does the opposite. Elastic, done. Inelastic. If you increase the price, guess what? Your revenue does the same. Decrease the price, your revenue does the same. You can measure the revenue with your demand curve. Did you know you can measure it as a box? The box between the price and your quantity. The reason is because revenue is price times quantity. Supply curves, same thing. If you move up, you're dealing with an expansion. If you move down, you are dealing with a contraction. A shift to the left is a decrease, and a shift to the right is an increase. Supply curves slope upwards primarily because it's more expensive to produce more units. We say marginal costs increase as quantity increases, forcing firms to increase price. Firms also want to produce more the higher the price because it gets them more motivated. There is a profit incentive. Factors that shift your supply left or right are called the conditions of supply, and these are factors that affect the willingness of firms to supply something and also the ability for them to supply something. Things that could affect your willingness to supply something could be how fun it is, or how engaging it is, or how interesting it is. Things that affect firms' ability to supply something could be what their costs of production are doing, what's the raw material prices, are there any barriers to enter this market or grow in the market. We've talked about PES, but let's look at the graphs. If your supply curve is steeper, just say that this one's inelastic. Yes, use the word relatively. Can't believe I forgot that one. If something is flatter, say it's relatively elastic. And factors that will influence your PES are going to be factors that make a firm more or less able to supply in a market, following a price change. You're looking for things that make a firm more able to supply something. For example, can they store the product? How quick is the training? Quick training. Are there any barriers to grow this company? Are there any regulations that they have to follow? Next one. Excess demand and excess supply. Let's look at an example. Let's say, instead of the price being P1, let's say that the price is P2, such as because of a minimum price. To find the quantity supplied, go across from the price and find the demand curve. That is going to be the quantity demanded at that price. Very little, because the price is high, consumers can't afford it. To find the quantity supplied, go across, find the supply curve. And here there's a lot of supply because the prices are high and it's motivating the companies a lot. Here we have a situation of excess supply. Why? Because QS is higher than QD. And the excess supply is the distance in the quantity between there and there. I label it as QS minus QD. Other people label it as QD QS. Other people label it as QS QD. Take your pick. That is excess supply. Excess demand is really similar. Let's take a maximum price. Let's say that the price is here. How do we find the quantity supplied? We go across from the price, find the supply curve. This is the quantity supplied, go across, find the demand curve, quantity demanded. Here we have QD being higher than QS, so there is excess demand. How much is the excess demand? It's the difference between the demand and the supply. The excess demand is QD minus QS, or QS QD, or QD QS. Usually, free markets will eliminate excess demand and excess supply. It's going to eliminate them through three things: the rationing function, the incentive function, and the signaling function. These three things are going to eliminate excess demand and excess supply and restore an equilibrium. I'd like to show you how that works, but that's out of scope of this video, so that's more detailed. Take a look and I will make a video on that. Rationing is the idea that higher prices mean consumers can't afford the goods. They reduce their quantity demanded. Incentives is the idea that higher prices means firms think, ooh, maybe there is a profit opportunity here for me. So firms want to supply more. The signaling is that price change that just makes firms realize that there is an opportunity here, and the incentive then is, oh yeah, I can make more profits. The next one is consumer surplus and producer surplus. These are really good fun. Consumer surplus, it has a fun definition. It's generally a triangle. Now that might not be true all the time, but you can generally think at the triangle between your demand curve and the price of the good for all the quantity that's being sold. So consumer surplus, difference between demand, P1 and Q1. Producer surplus is generally the difference between the price, P1, and the supply curve for all of the quantity sold. These have fun definitions. Consumer surplus is the difference between what they're willing and able to pay and what they actually pay, P1, for all the units that they buy, Q1. Producer surplus is similar. It's the difference between what the producer sold the good for and what they were willing and able to pay for that good, for all the quantities that they bought. Now it's really important to remember it's for all the quantities bought or sold. So if we go back to a minimum price, your consumer surplus is going to be this little tiny bit, the difference between the price, P2, and the demand curve for all the quantity that is sold, which is going to be Q2. For producer surplus, it's going to be different because you're only selling Q2. The difference between your price and your supply curve is all of this. Now those questions are really rare, but just so you're aware, it doesn't have to be exactly a triangle. It usually 90% of the time is. If the demand increases in a market, it's going to lead to a new price of P2. So there will be a greater difference between what consumers are willing and able to pay and what they actually do pay. That's the change in consumer surplus. Taxes. If you have a tax, an indirect tax, it can be split into two. You've got unit taxes or specific taxes, and you have ad valorem taxes or percentage taxes. Percentage taxes do this to a supply curve. The difference between them is the tax, which changes depending on the price of the good. A unit tax is going to shift the supply curve parallel by the tax. a tax always leads to a change in price. Well, actually, there's a couple of exceptions depending on the PED. An increase in the price. That means that some of the tax is going to be passed on to consumers. Please remember that the difference between that is the tax. But that height is a lot higher than the change in the price. It's like a little bit higher. Price only changed by the blue and the tax changed by green. Prices increase, but they never cover the full tax. Here in the diagram on the right, price increases from P1 to P2. The tax is all of this, which as you can see is much higher than the price. Taxes reduce the quantity from Q1 to Q2. This means that you might want to tax goods that are bad for society, like maybe cigarettes and maybe alcohol. Taxes will generate tax revenue. To calculate tax revenue, be sure you multiply the tax, which is that green bit, times the quantity sold with the tax, which will be Q2. If you do this, so grab the tax, go across the quantity Q2, you will get a box like this. Tax times Q2. The consumer incidence is going to be the increase in price times Q2, which basically you can just think about as the area of the top box. The producer incidence is going to be the bottom box. That's all about taxes for now. Subsidies are really similar with a couple of differences. Supply curve shifts down by the subsidy. It's going to lead to a reduction in price from P1 to P2 and Q1 to Q2. The subsidy is the distance between there and there, and if you have your eyes peeled, the distance between there and there is a lot larger than the decrease in the price. Subsidies cost the government money. The cost to the government is going to be how many units they subsidized. They subsidize Q2 units, so you want to go across all of Q2 units and you want to go up by the subsidy, which means all this much money has been spent on subsidizing this good, like education or like healthcare. We're also going to have a similar impact on consumers. Consumers are going to benefit because the share of the subsidy is going to be passed on to them by lower prices. And guess what? This is also going to be a box, but it's going to be the box at the bottom. Producers are also going to benefit because they were given all of this green money and they only had to pass the yellow money in lower prices to consumers, so they got to keep the blue bit. So this is the producer benefit. There might be some other bits that you'll have to calculate with regard to these graphs, so keep your eyes peeled for this. This could be a tricky one. Externalities are good fun. Here are some rules to simplify it. If you're dealing with supply, you are dealing with everything ending in costs. You are dealing with private costs, sometimes called Mpc. You're dealing with external costs, called Mec. And you're dealing with social costs, MSC. And it's a cool equation, please have a go remembering. MSC equals Mpc plus Mec. The rule of thumb is, if you have a negative production externality, society wants to produce less of that good. So society, like the one society cares about, wants to produce less. And that's such a simplification. Happy to go through this with you in more detail another time. Whereas the private company is going to want to produce more. If this is a positive externality, society would love more, but the firm is just not going to do that. And here is your graph with supply externalities, production externalities. The free market, remember, is always selfish. In a free market, we're going to get the private firm and the private individuals having the free market equilibrium. So Mpc is going to equal Mpv, which I haven't drawn, but by the way, is here. More on this in a second. So the free market is going to look at this one, collaborate with this one, and that's going to be the free market quantity and the free market price. This one with this one, free market quantity, free market price. It would be ideal though if people had really considered like the benefits to everyone, not just themselves. So the social optimum is if MSC equals MSB. Just remember that. MSC, here, social optimum, price at the social optimum. MSC, MSB, price at the social optimum, quantity at the social optimum. So you can see that a free market will always produce at the red bit and never match up with the yellow bit, which means we're going to get something called a welfare loss. There will always be a loss in welfare compared to the optimum welfare at the free market equilibrium. To figure out that welfare loss, follow these steps. Step number 1, go from QFM, and then it's really weird instructions, but you want to go up. You want to go up and highlight, that's going to make English sense, highlight the gap between the curves that you've just drawn. And then you're going to shade in a triangle. Have a go, write that down, things will get better. Let's start with the top diagram. Go from QFM, highlight the gap between the curves, and then shade in triangle. Next one, go from QFM, gap between the supply curves, shade in triangle. Now there's a whole story behind that. Love to explain that to you, but not for this revision though. In terms of consumption stuff, really similar, aside from a couple differences. First of all, you're dealing with benefits. Everything ends in a B. Always. marginal private benefit, marginal external benefit, marginal social benefit. If it is a positive consumption externality, something like vaccines or something like education, society would love more of this, MSB. But individual firms don't necessarily want to do that because they're only thinking about themselves and not thinking about others. If this is a negative externality, something like cigarettes, society would love less of these. But people being a bit selfish aren't necessarily wanting that. Again, what's going to happen? In a free market, we are going to look at the intersection between Mpc and Mpv. That one and this one, which is going to be here. QFM, PFM. That's what society is going to do. It's going to consume too many cigarettes, not enough healthcare. Ideally, though, we had really fully considered the full benefits of everything and the cost of everything. Society would have loved this equilibrium. QSO and PSO. Remember to work out the welfare loss. What do? Go from QFM, you go up, you highlight the difference between the curves and then shade in the triangle. Next one, start from QFM, highlight the gap, shade in the triangle. And that's great. Governments intervene with externalities because the free market always produces QFM and that just never equals QSO. And we know that this causes a welfare loss. So governments through their methods could potentially, if they can reach QSO, that's their goal. If they can get to QSO, they're going to improve welfare. Another thing that causes market failure is a public good. For a public good, you need to know two things: non-rival, non-excludable. You can get some great definitions on this online. Essentially, because of these two things, you're going to get something called an even cooler word, a free rider problem, which is going to mean that people are going to use the good and not pay for it. And because no one is paying, and people can still use it, firms think, that's it, I'm out, I'm not going to make any money in this market. So there is just like no supply curve. And technically there's no demand curve because no one actually wants to pay for the good. So really, a public good graph looks like that. There's nothing in it. And so a government, what it could do is just supply a given quantity. Maybe this is what the government will want to do, to supply a given quantity. Information gaps, info gaps, are when the consumer or the producer isn't fully clued up on the costs or the benefits of something. So for example, they might not be aware, they're just not aware, possibly, what kinds of foods might cause obesity. Or they might not be aware all of the chemicals inside cigarettes because perhaps it's not published on the paper. You have asymmetric information when one party knows more than the other. So for example, maybe the cigarette company knows more than the average consumer. The cigarette company probably knows what kind of chemicals the cigarettes has inside it and releases, whereas the consumer has a kind of vague idea, but maybe isn't clued up on all of the dangers related to it. This is a really big problem because maybe consumers will demand too many cigarettes when what would actually be best for them is to demand less, and maybe they would have demanded less if they were fully clued up on what the dangers were of buying cigarettes. So information gaps, asymmetric information, is going to lead to probably the wrong quantity of cigarettes being bought and sold in the market. Here, the individual that is misinformed or underinformed is going to consume Q1, but what would have been best for them is to consume Q best. So there is going to be too much production of cigarettes, too much consumption of cigarettes, and welfare is not doing very good. It's going to be a misallocation of resources. In other words, that's one of the market failures. We've looked at taxes and we've looked at subsidies, we've looked at maximum prices and minimum prices. Let's check out tradable pollution permits. These tradable pollution permits are like little tickets given to firms, not physical necessarily, but they're kind of tokens that allow you to supply a certain quantity. They allow you to pollute a certain quantity, and you can't produce more than the tickets allow you to. So this is really good because then the government can control how much pollution is generated by giving firms only a certain amount of tickets. What's cool about tradable pollution permits in addition is companies can buy and sell them. So the idea is all these eco-friendly companies will have lots of tickets to sell. And so they're making money from these tickets. And because they make money, they're incentivized and rewarded for being good, for not polluting very much. So maybe they can reinvest their money and maybe they can grow and become more successful over time. Compared to a more polluting company is going to have to keep buying and buying more of these pollution permits, which is going to increase their costs and is going to give them less of an opportunity to grow their company. And it's just also probably going to reduce the quantity that they can make today. And this way you get more eco-friendly production methods succeeding and more polluting methods not doing very well. Provision of public goods is when the government just outright provides a certain supply of goods. This is really expensive. Typically, the government doesn't sell the good for a price. It's typically used to intervene in public goods. They just supply a given quantity and they give it for free, making it incredibly expensive. They could also provide information. The government could give out leaflets saying smoking is harmful, smoking has all these chemicals, don't do it. They can cause all these problems to your lungs, causing demand to fall from D1 to D2. Now, if you were going to do some really cool graphs, I would suggest you merge the graphs together if you feel confident. So, for example, you can draw this really cool graph with a positive consumption externality, where the free market is going to reduce here, but what would be desired is QSO. The government wants to increase the quantity, right? So one of the ways they could do it is by introducing a subsidy to the firms. If they do a subsidy of that much, you're going to get the new selfish equilibrium between selfish firms and selfish consumers coinciding at this quantity, and therefore you have solved the problem. People are now consuming the right amount of education or the right amount of vaccines. Government failure occurs when it happens sometimes. Government failure occurs if the benefits of their intervention is smaller than the costs of their intervention. Now, of course, they don't set out to do that. It's just something goes wrong in the process. For example, maybe there was a delay in building a railway and maybe this added hundreds of millions. That could increase the cost so much that the costs start to outweigh the benefits. This would then cause government failure, and what that means is that the government intervenes and actually decreases social welfare, which is really interesting because they're setting out to improve it and then they've done the exact opposite. That's it for Year 12 Micro. Hope that was really useful and interesting, and let me know any other videos you'd like me to do. Hit the subscribe button. You'll get some more half hour or whatever revision sessions.